there's such a heavy weight from the government, from the USDA against raw milk. It doesn't even make sense.
They intentionally mislead because those were all funded by the industries that wanted to be on the bottom of that pyramid.
We believe it's crucial to get this information out there to the public so that they can know exactly what's in their food and how to heal themselves. Why there's such a massive potential here in regenerative agriculture is because we can essentially reverse desertification. We can bring the excess water vapor that's in our atmosphere back down into the soil. We can start producing nutrient-dense food again and heal America.
This is going to be our longest and most powerful episode, I think. All right, hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Remnant Finance. Today we've got an awesome guest. We've got the founder of Perennial Pastures Ranch. We're going to be talking to Kevin Muno. We met briefly at an event. There's a chiropractor in San Diego County here. His name is Dr. Stanton Holm, and he runs the Future Generations Clinic. Everybody should check out his podcast, the Future Generations Podcast. He's a big leader in the health freedom space. And so he had an event up at his clinic in Escondido a couple months ago. And my wife's a big fan of the podcast. And so we went up there to check it out and briefly met Kevin at the event. But I think we chatted for a little bit and then just went on our way. And about a month ago, had a call scheduled through the Nelson Nash Institute Practitioner Finder. And I think within about 30 seconds, we realized, I was like, wait a second, I kind of recognize you. And I think we've met before. And then before you even said it, you just said you were a rancher in San Diego County. And I said, wait, do you own Perennial Pastures? And it's been great getting to know you. And we want to talk about a little bit of your background, how you got into ranching. We'll talk about regenerative ranching, what that is specifically, about your company, the idea of healing the soil, because that's something that ties into what we'll talk about at the end with your investment. We're going to talk dairy, we're going to talk raw milk, and obviously IBC. And then we'll let you kind of cover the investment opportunity that you've got going on, your Series B at the moment. But let's start with a little background, little bio, where you're from, and how you got into all this.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Hans. Thanks, Brian, for having me on. Great to be with you guys. Appreciate what you do. Kevin Muno, first generation rancher, originally from Southern California. I was born in LA, went to school in downtown LA, all boys Catholic school called Loyola High School, literally pretty much in the heart of downtown. Grew up playing baseball. That was my passion. I always wanted to be a baseball player, play professionally. My brother, who's 13 months younger than me, we were always the double play combination. He ended up going and playing in the big leagues, and we played in college together. So started out playing ball, came down to San Diego on a scholarship to University of San Diego, and got really into just all things peak performance. And for those of you who have performed at your peak before, whether you're a military pilot or a professional sports player, you know how important nutrition is to perform at any sort of peak in life. So I really got into the paleo diet and eating grass-fed beef. I read the Paleo Diet book by Dr. Lauren Cordain, and I was immediately hooked onto what we would call an evolutionary diet, something that we've eaten for a long time, which is meat, and later added milk and things like that. But the paleo diet was just originally meat-based and veggie-based and roots. And I felt amazing, and I was performing really great in the gym, recovering very quickly, performing really good on the field. And so immediately got hooked. And that was really my start, was looking at our food system, looking at how we perform as human beings at our peaks. Went and played, my career there at University of San Diego. Ended up getting hurt my junior year. And so I kind of had this crossroads, fork in the road, if you will. I was playing Houston Rice in Texas, and I took a 94-mile-an-hour fastball to the hand and ended up breaking my hand, finished the game. Definitely tried to side more with the hockey player approach than the soccer player approach, but we won't go into that. Sorry for the soccer players out there. My hand was clicking, but finished up, proud of myself. Sitting there in the emergency room waiting for my hand to be casted, and there was a gentleman on the other side of the curtain who glanced over, was on life support. And here I am feeling sorry for myself, and I asked the nurse what was going on with this gentleman, and he was in a gang-related accident and had a gunshot wound to the head and they were just waiting for his family to come in to say their goodbyes. So here I am feeling sorry for myself. My whole career is, kind of in flux, and I just looked up to God at that point and said, okay, well, what do you want me to do? And I didn't know it at the time, but he was calling me to be a regenerative rancher. And so that's where it started for me, really, was at that moment where I took everything I knew from baseball and performing at a peak, and athletics and teamwork and my training at business school at University of San Diego, and started going in a different direction. It started small. It started with gardening and permaculture and homesteading, and then it started leading to bigger and bigger things, bigger and bigger impact. And the more I went down the regenerative agriculture rabbit hole, the more I was drinking the Kool-Aid, and the more excited I was about the movement and where it was and how it was growing and our ability to grow food and heal people. So that was, I graduated in 2011. I'm 37 years old. I took my permaculture design course in 2013. I started working with some pioneers in the industry, learned a lot from them at an early age. It's probably one of my biggest strengths is I just go to the best in the business, and I'm fearless to ask them, to coach me or work together. And I was blessed to be able to do that. And then during the pandemic in 2020, I was able to raise some money with some investors and buy a local cattle company here in San Diego. And we started that. So we acquired 280 head of cattle, cow-calf pairs, and about 16,000 acres of leased ground. We leased the Navy base in Fallbrook, which is 8,000 acres there. We had a lease up in Warner Springs, another 8,000 acres when we first started. We just lost that lease, unfortunately. And then we have another lease in Oak Grove, which is close to Temecula, but all within San Diego County. So we've been running that business now for a while. We have a ranching entity and a meat business. The meat business is called Perennial Pastures. We're in 15 farmers markets in Southern California, across Orange County, San Diego, and LA counties. We sell online, and we have nationwide distribution. And so our business has grown to the point where we've needed to set up a whole supply chain. And that's what we're doing now, is really building a regenerative supply chain along with our own production. We work with amazing partner ranches throughout the US that we aggregate from, that all produce to regenerative standard. So we're working on building that. We're doing the hard work of building a supply chain. There's not a ton of regenerative production that's out there. There's a lot of new certifications. So our passion is around, bringing good food to the people, nutrient dense food. And our mission statement is enriching life by restoring connections, healing land, and nourishing people. So that's what we're all about. I'm excited to talk to you guys about that today.
Yeah, that's awesome. We got a lot to go from gardening to having a huge ranching operation, but I want to think maybe you undersold your baseball talents, but not only like you played baseball, but you were the captain of the USD team, right?
Yeah, I was at one point, I think my senior year.
Kevin and his wife, Dina, and my wife, Stacy, they were all at USD at the same time. And I no overlap that I know of, but my wife played lacrosse there, and she said that at that time the USD team was really, really good. So that's cool that you're the captain of that team. But all right, so gardening, I want to go just maybe back a little bit to that, because that was like a 10-year kind of span in 30 seconds. But as far as the gardening goes, because myself, I'm a terrible gardener. I try and fail consistently. And the best things that I have in my little garden out back are the ones that after the season ended, I didn't plant and didn't know they were there. And now those are the strongest things that are growing right now. So I kind of think the best thing I can do is just to not try with gardening, and then just have some dirt and stuff seems to grow. But what kind of gardening did you do? And then can you explain a little bit more about what permaculture is, how you got into that specifically, what that looks like on a practical level? Like I've heard of that, or heard people talking about it, but what were you actually doing at the time to get that kind of training and exposure?
Yeah, so it started out with just basic organic gardening. I took some classes here locally. I forget the name of the group now. This is about 12 years ago. I think it was Good Neighbor Gardens, but it was a group that just did simple gardening training, and we would go, in the back of folks' yards and set up gardens. And I remember liking that, but when I found permaculture, it was a whole new approach, and it was more integrative. So permaculture started in Australia. These guys, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren wrote a book on it. It's a whole design philosophy of how to connect a lot of different elements in your landscape, your homestead, or your farm. And it's a whole design approach, and it centers itself around nature and natural principles, and again, restoring connections. So harvesting water from your roof, and putting that into the garden, or designing your garden in a way that has multiple different layers. So you might have a tree that grows up that provides mulch for some annual plants or shade, or the whole idea is getting the whole system working with one another. And based off of what I'd read, from the paleo diet, and then some of my early childhood memories of just being outside in nature, I like the whole approach of just working with nature, because she always bats last, and there's a lot of inherent wisdom in nature when we look at it and how it works. So just trying to steward that along, I was super connected to. And so that's what permaculture does. There's some books out there, Permaculture 1 or The Designer's Manual are really good books. Designer's Manual is written by Bill Mollison. So you can take a whole permaculture design course and certificate, and there's some here in San Diego County. San Diego Sustainable Living Institute is one that puts those on, and that's where I took my early PDC in 2013. So I was exposed at an early point in my career to these design philosophies, and permaculture applies itself a little bit more towards smaller landscapes and small farms, and then regenerative agriculture is kind of a larger circle in that realm, where it pulls from lineages more on the ranching side, but uses a lot of the same principles of soil building and restoring the connections of how nature works, and the different life cycles, and the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle. So they're all related. They all kind of have their own design implications, but that's where it started for me. And then when I started to look at how could I do, at one point I told my wife, we'll be fine. We're just going to grow all our own food, and I won't have to work, and we'll just live off the land, and live the hippie dream and the hippie lifestyle. But that soon was not a reality for me. And then, okay, I was like, how do I make a living at this? And then ranching really came in, and I fell in love with ranching and the Western lifestyle and the romanticism about, horses and ranching. And there's a lot of history just here in the West involved with ranching and horses, and how things sort of got settled. And so, yeah, and you can heal massive amounts of landscape and watersheds through the proper management and movement of livestock and herbivores. So I was immediately drawn to that as a way to maximize the impact.
Yeah, Kevin, I want to actually ask you about that. I know a little bit because one of my best friends in the world has a really small regenerative farm here, who you've talked to on the phone.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit familiar, but can you explain, like you said, healing the land? For one, I think most people just don't even know how a standard farm or ranch operates and what they've done since, like, say, the 1950s,
Right.
and what it means to heal the land, what that process is, what that timeline is. I would think that the general public has no idea. If you say you want to heal the land, like, they would say, well, what's wrong with it?
Right.
So it's a big, and
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're going to probably have to go back all the way to the dawn of agriculture, when we first started tilling the land and producing annual crops so that we could develop cities and stop hunting and gathering for our food. And so that was right, the Fertile Crescent. We all kind of grew up, learning about that and Western civilization. And so we found out that we could take seeds that we were gathering and cultivate them and then plant them. But to do that, we needed to break the soil so that those very fragile seeds could germinate, and we could harvest excess and then store that excess. And then so everybody didn't have to be, a farmer or a rancher to survive and make a living. That is how we've developed specializations where we can all go work in finance and build big armies and, and drive Teslas, right? And so annual agriculture, inherently, the growing of crops, started with tillage, and now we know that tillage is not healthy. When you break the soil and you destroy the soil structure, you're literally breaking a house. Healthy soil has aggregates, has life, has airspace. That airspace allows water to infiltrate. And when you come in with a plow or even chemicals. It will destroy that life and collapse the house. And so regenerative agriculture is all about working with the life cycles of nature, the carbon cycle, the mineral cycle, the nutrient cycle, and just looking, how does nature build soil? How were our Midwest soils built? The Midwest has some of the most nutrient dense soils in the world, some of the deepest soils. I've taken soil cores in the Midwest and they go down feet deep. We don't know in some areas how deep they really go and how deep they used to be when nature was building soil. So nature builds soil in a way of animal integration, of diversity, of harvesting sunlight as long as possible, not having bare ground. Nature abhors bare ground, so tillage does not really exist in nature. So the deepest topsoils were built with animals. Think of the bison that have roamed the plains in the Midwest and even the eastern seaboard. Think of all the National Geographic documentaries that you've seen with the wildebeest migrations and these massive herds stomping dung and urinating in an area and then going on and oftentimes not coming back to that area for upwards of a year. And so that grazing, that pulsing, the removing of the vegetation, the trampling of it down, gardeners know that a good mulch layer conserves water and feeds the soil, feeds carbon, right? Keeps the soil surface cool so you can have good germination. And so that water does not evaporate and your soil doesn't erode away. So the livestock do that for us. They trample, they leave litter, they clear the growth points at the bottoms of the plants. The grasses have evolved to needing to have been cleared and then rested. And it's that constant pulsing where the vegetation's removed. The roots slough off below the ground to feed the soil biology and carbon. And biology is really the key for soil building because there's a whole war and symphony going on down there where they're kind of eating one another, the protozoa, the amoebas, the nematodes, the fungi. It's all working together to create soil aggregates, which is pore space. Think chocolate cake. The more water you infiltrate, the deeper the roots can go, and it all just kind of works together. So really humans, our key role is being stewards of that life cycle, of all those life cycles, and just making sure that we're managing our crops in a way, our animals in a way that benefits that. So it all comes back to management. How do we move the cattle? How do we sow cover crops? How do we harvest sunlight to maximize photosynthesis and photosynthate going down into the ground to feed that biology and just maximizing that throughout the year? So that's, long-winded answer to your question of what is regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, but what I'm curious about is, healing the land. So if you took over or, started leasing a farm that had not been properly managed for the last 50, 60, 70 years plus, what's your process? How do you fix that? How long does that take?
That's a great question. So, yeah, most land, if you were to take over a conventional farm, let's say, and it's been tilled and sprayed for decades since the Industrial Revolution of us, bringing our wartime practices from World War II back to the earth, it's got no soil aggregates, it's got no soil biology. So the first step would probably be to bring animals back into the system. At some point in our agricultural history, we separated them for, definitely the industrial benefits, right? You were either a farmer or you were a rancher. Before that, most crop farms had animals on it. If you didn't integrate the animals directly in the pasture, or at least using their manure to enrich the soil afterwards and spreading that back out. So the first step I would do would be to get the infrastructure correct, meaning the right fencing and water systems in so that you could manage the animals in a high density grazing situation. And I'd start integrating the animals back in, getting that portable fertilizing system back in throughout the land, starting to manage the grasses or whatever you had there that would pop up. So if you're starting with bare soil, right, then you're just trying to get that to grow something so you can get it harvesting sunlight and get that photosynthesis process back intact. And then if you're growing crops, you can work in those crops kind of in between when the livestock come through, start sowing some cover crops, and then the livestock could graze those cover crops as well. Then after they graze those cover crops, you want to then sow your cash crop. Then you could sell the meat or the milk off the crop farm as well. So this whole process, with our tool set that we have now, Brian, probably takes 3 to 5 years to really start seeing some pretty good results. You can start seeing decent soil aggregate formation in 2 to 3 years 5 years, you maybe got a base layer of perennial grasses or whatever type of crop that you want to see. So it can happen quickly. And that's the beauty of what we can do now, why there's such a massive potential here in regenerative agriculture, is because we can essentially reverse desertification. We can bring the excess water vapor that's in our atmosphere back down into the soil. We could start producing nutrient dense food again and heal America, which, is a whole kind of national security debate in and of itself. And curious to kind of see how you guys saw that in your military experience of folks, performing maybe like less and less on different performance tests and whatnot. And I've heard some stats on that of like, World War II era and how many folks passed, and then in your guys' era, how many folks passed physical tests and different types of tests, and the military is a good indication of that because of how long you guys have been testing and doing all that, right?
It's frightening, man. Right now, 77% of graduating boys or men from high school are not eligible to join the military physically. It's frightening. Yeah, it's bad.
That's one metric. But if you actually, when you're in the military and you see the people that you're working with, it's not the cream of the crop, even though, the stats on who qualifies from the general population are shocking enough. But like looking around, it's not like you're walking around, a SEAL base when you're just in a normal military environment, particularly the Navy. Like you walk around a ship and you're like, how are these people getting up the stairs?
Yeah.
And the standards are so ridiculously low. People couldn't pass the run test, so they added like the exercise bike for the PT test. People couldn't pass that, so they added the elliptical. It is like, it's a joke. So just seeing a bunch of fats on an elliptical doing their PT test. And then of course you have different standards for male and female, and the state of military health is pretty atrocious. You do have, now I'll say that there's a subsection, maybe a quarter of your squadron or ship or whatever, there are people that are very into health and that are very fit and work out all the time, but it's not like everyone in the if you watch a military movie, everyone's just these like chiseled studs.
Sure. Yeah.
And that is, it could not be further from the truth. It might as well be a truck stop bathroom for like the average person you see on a ship. But back to I want to ask about the agriculture and the tilling the soil and stuff. Like when and this is kind of laying the groundwork very well for the investment that we'll talk about at the end. When you're looking at a new area and you're going to go and heal soil, get a new lease, you're going to graze the cattle there, et cetera. Are you doing crops as well? Or are you mainly referring to the grass and whatever grows naturally in that area? Like, are you actually, I guess you're not tilling, but are you actually, planting crops on top of it to sell as well as part of, because I don't know anything about this, so my questions are going to be very 101 level.
Yeah.
Are you like, I already know this is a stupid question, but are you like putting a row of cucumber plants in the middle of like the grazing land when we're talking about mixing all these things together? Or is it just is it like this, 10,000 acre land is going to have a lot of crops, but not in the exact area where the grazing is? We're focusing on the grass there. Like, how do you actually split it up? Or
that's a good question. I mean, there is more integrative approaches to having both crops and livestock on the same acreage. There's a guy out of Australia who's developed a whole system called pasture cropping. His name's Colin Seiss, and he has dedicated perennial pasture, which for those of you that don't know the difference between annuals and perennials, annuals have a life cycle of 1 year. They grow up and die. So think of your corn plant or spinach or any of your veggies. A perennial plant, which, think of trees, and then there's perennial grasses, which is what, we're fired up on, because the perennial grasses have very deep root systems. They can live, decades, if not longer. So you can have annuals sowed in with perennial grasses. And it's a technique to maximize photosynthesis, because after you graze an area down hard and the perennial grasses kind of get eaten down to the crown of the roots, they sort of go dormant for a period of time, right? And so if you were to come in and no-till in, which no-tilling means you have these special planters that come in and they just kind of create a little slit in the soil, and they drop a seed in, and then there's a press wheel that comes behind it and sows in without tilling. So these no-till planters have been huge innovation for us to be able to not turn the soil over, but still get annual plants in. So you could do a quick annual no-till pass and get some germination of an annual crop, a cash crop, whether it be corn or wheat or barley or what have you. And so it is possible to do that. That's a very advanced system and kind of only works in certain latitudes. It's very hard to do up in the northern climates like in Montana and Idaho and some of the northern Great Belt, because they just have such a low photosynthetic period. But in the Corn Belt, and kind of the warmer grain growing regions, it is definitely possible there. And there's folks getting multiple harvests and multiple yields and maximizing photosynthesis throughout the year.
Were those, I mean, I know you're not tilling, but
like a half inch, so like barely just kind of cuts like a little V in the soil with these cutting coulters, and then it drops in a little seed, and then has a press wheel that comes by it, and we can link to a no-till planter maybe in the show notes or something like that, but so you guys can see it. So yeah, it is possible, but my focus is mostly on the ranching side. We don't really do a lot of crops. It's mostly just on the ranching. So for us, we're trying to cultivate diverse perennial pastures, of 10, 20, 30 plus species of perennials that all kind of fill different niches and have different roles to play in the pasture. And the whole goal is no bare ground, maximize photosynthesis, so having something green growing in the ground as long as possible. There's a whole approach to this, and we work with a certification group called Regenerative, and there's emerging regenerative certification groups that are out there, and they have a whole protocol to this. They call it the 6-3-4. So 6 soil health principles, 3 rules for compounding regenerative agriculture, and the 4 ecosystem processes. So we can link to that as well, but covered a few of those 6 soil health principles, like keeping your soil covered, maximizing photosynthesis, diversity in the pasture, animal integration. Those are 4 right there of the 6. So
Before I had met Hans, the first company when I started infinite banking, I called it Perennial Wealth Concepts, based on that kind of evergreen concept
yeah,
of
totally. Yeah.
using it for generations. And we sort of stuck with that evergreen nature,
No, I know. I love that.
out here. But before we renamed
Well,
to
it's
Remnant
cool. I mean,
Finance,
that's almost like a homage to Nelson too, being that he was a forester, and I started reading the books, and I was like, it's always like these forester, like nature hands-on guys that like really kind of grasp these concepts at its core, because it's like when you look at how the math of how nature works, and that's what drew me to infinite banking was you're building the soil, and with building your own bank, you're like building soil too, and the fact that you're having this dividend, very safe dividend producing storage facility that produces a yield every year, but then it just keeps, and that is a rule so one of the third rules is compounding in that 6-3-4 framework is compounding, right? Like nature does not work. It's not linear. So there's compounding and cascading effects. It can get really bad really fast, or it can get great really fast, right? And like that early stage of building that farm that we just talked about is slow, but once it gets going, like there's a point, and they talk about this in permaculture too, like year 5, that like you got all these components working together and the system just pops, and you're like, whoa, you're just kind of sitting back and you're looking at it. And when you look at those illustrations on the IBC, it's like at some point it just pops. And then when you add in like this other investment framework and some of the rentals and other passive income, real asset producing sort of yields and structures, like that's when I think it really starts to come, is like you get all this diversity of cool investment opportunities feeding into this central system, which I see as like the soil. So I was like, I'm a big pattern guy, and I was like, after I finally connected to that, I was like, yeah, this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. So
and it's not even just feeding into it; it's also feeding from it, which is what's cool. So it has that whole regenerative idea of it. It all kind of back in and through the system.
yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
But right before we go on to more IBC, or I mean, we could talk as long as you want. I love hearing what you're talking about. But I read a book by Joel Salatin maybe a year ago or so, the Marvelous Pigness of Pigs. Have you read that one?
Yeah, he has so many. I haven't read
He
that
has
one,
so
but
many, but
yeah,
that one was cool, and it was talking about the nature of the pig, and it's wild. We're talking about healing the land, and the cows come, they leave their manure, they move on. He brings the pigs in, who, while most human beings look at that and think it's disgusting, they love rooting their nose through that.
yeah,
And by doing that and trampling the ground, they're pushing those nutrients into bare, destroyed soil. and then they leave their end of it and they chew up what they chew up. And it was cool. It was like, his whole system, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, was bringing through particular types of animals at particular times to do their particular thing that they're designed by God to do. And it heals the land in a certain system and in a certain process that speeds up that process. Really cool, man. It was fascinating.
Yeah, he's kind of the master on that multi-species grazing, and it's hard to pull off. As I've seen folks get into this field, he's one of those guys that everybody tries to mimic. There is sort of potential to have what we call death by diversity, trying to do too many things too early before you really kind of mimic one sort of anchor enterprise. So we're kind of recommending now, if you're going to get into this, have one anchor enterprise and then start adding other ones as you kind of get that first anchor enterprise going, because it's super exciting and folks want to do the chickens and the pigs and the cows and the sheep and the goats and all of it. And they all have roles to play. But if you do all of that at once, you're kind of like, oh crap, the goats are getting out and the pigs are over tilling my land and the chickens are dying from the coyotes, and you can kind of get in trouble in a hurry. So we've focused on just sort of cattle to start as our main enterprise, and we've aggregated from other really great regenerative producers. But eventually, we do want to get into all those species and provide a full grocery cart full of goods for our local community here. But it takes time, and it's all hard work, but it's all really fun too.
A lot of us in our industry call that the noise.
Yeah.
If you're not just looking at one thing and not building one thing, you end up getting all these noisy things happening, and you can't handle too much.
There's a good documentary out recently on salads, and I think it's called Lunatic Farmer. But and his thing is it's like not trying to scale and become this nationwide power. It's like people, once you lock down your one area, people want to just expand and grow and scale and get to being the best at all facets. But he kind of takes the approach of like, I'm going to stick with what I'm good at on the land that I know. I'm not trying to get this massive growth and be a multinational powerhouse in this. Like, I'm just going to do what I'm really good at. But I want to transition from the grass to the cattle, because it's kind of a good analogy. Like, I've heard, I'm going to ballpark the idea that I've heard, that our largest crop as a nation is lawns. Like the most money, the most water, the most resources for crops in our country goes to people just maintaining their lawns, which is shallow, pointless root systems that provide no value, versus what should be happening with grass is these long, deep roots. So in that same analogy, when we talk about what you're doing, and if you guys go to Perennial Pastures website and read kind of the About Us section, I'm actually writing an article about you for our newsletter, which I'll run by you before we go through it. But, one of the things that we need to talk through in making the contrast here, like the equivalent, the food equivalent of shallow, pointless lawn grass would be factory farming. But there is a reason for it. It's not just that these corporations are trying to squeeze out every nickel and poison you, whatever. If most of the population, myself included, is dependent on the grocery store for food, how are you going to feed all these people? And so, what you sell couldn't at this point scale to providing the entire nation's grocery needs, because people want cheap, they want it on demand. We have this just-in-time inventory cycle where if you're expecting to just buy a 5-pound bag of chicken wings like that at the store every single time you go in, that's probably 50 chickens that are, 25 chickens to make those 50 wings. If we just have this endless desire for instant mass-produced food, well, the result is going to be these massive stockyards where the cattle are just crammed in there. When you have that kind of crowding at a whether it's chicken or pigs or whatever, you're going to have all these, whatever diseases going around. They're going to have to standardize. They're going to have to vaccinate, not that they have to, but the demand creates the factory farming model, because people aren't willing to pay the premium that you need for this healthy, properly grown from animals that aren't just herded into these giant pens, live terrible lives, and then die, just awful deaths, pumped full of chemicals. So our demand side feeds that, and we need to be willing to understand what we're buying and reach into like the supply process. And this is a great example, like getting to know who's behind your food. Factory farming, if you can give a little background of like the what and the why and what the problem is. I don't want to just attack it like, how dare they factory farm? Well, we demand it, And so, but for those of us that want to get out of that and want to actually source good food, good meat, Can you compare and contrast how you raise a cattle, or, how you raise a cow, how their life is in the butchering process as well, compared to what we all think of with factory farming and just basically poison meat?
So factory farming, I would say, applies a little bit more to pigs and chickens because they can spend their whole lives actually in a barn and still, I guess, live. You could call it living, but factory model is definitely full bore on with those two proteins, turkeys as well. I should say poultry and pork. The beauty of cattle, there is a factory component, which is the confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs, or feedlots. But all cattle start out on grass, whether you're a grain finished animal or a grass finished. So from that standpoint, if you were just to eat one protein, I'd say eat beef, because at least that has started out on grass. And if we're looking at inflammation, which is the root of most of the chronic disease epidemic that we have right now, you're going to get a better omega-6 to omega-3 profile, which is also at the root of a lot of chronic inflammation, is we have too much omega-6, the more inflammatory omega fatty acid in our diet today. I think the SAD, the standard American diet, which is very apropos, I think is around 16 to 1, I believe, if you were to eat kind of along the lines of the food pyramid. And so this grass-fed, grass-finished beef that we're producing, optimal for humans is 3 to 1, omega-6 to 1. And this grass-fed beef that we're producing is oftentimes 1 to 1. The best I've seen is 0.8 to 1. So it's very balancing. So if you were just to eat one protein, I would say eat beef, because even if it's finished in a feedlot, which could be a 3 to 5 month process, at least it has some of those micronutrients that came from grass and the pasture. Now, on that whole spectrum of beef, right, we know that all beef starts out on grass, and then some are finished in a feedlot, which do produce a more acidic environment, and they have to be medicated and different things like that as they're finishing. The finishing process does add some very nice tenderness because they tend to be finished younger, and fat, which has some flavor in it. However, we now know regeneratively that if it comes off a regenerative ranch and from nutrient dense soils that are taking those minerals and the biology is making it bioavailable to the plant, well, the cow's going to eat that plant. It's going to be part of the tissues and the meat and the muscle and the fats and make its way to us. So we have data now from labs at Utah State with Dr. Stefan von Vliet that show our beef next to the grass-fed standard, next to the grain-finished standard. So we have 3 times the amount of omega-3s compared to grain-finished beef, and we're even better on some grass-fed metrics as well. So that kind of is the spectrum, and there's definitely still conventional sort of grass-fed finished ranches where they're just doing maybe a loose rotational grazing, which is still detrimental to the pastures because you get some overgrazed plants and some over-rested plants. Regenerative is really the top of that, where you're building these super diverse pastures with deep root systems that are tapping down deep into those minerals, and then they're coming up to the plants. And again, it's a whole cycle. So we want to be transparent across the whole, and that's another thing that's kind of key to this movement is transparency, where you don't really see too many marketing images of cows standing in their own dung and urine, in a pen, or, a bird that's been kept in a cage its whole life. That's hard to market. What we're doing is the ultimate marketing, I say opportunity, but it's just what we do. We're not marketing anything other than what we're doing, which is mimicking nature, building soil. And now we have the ability to document the nutrient density side, which is kind of the ultimate, especially when we're trying to make America healthy again. So that's like the whole spectrum. You can have poultry that's done well, and our poultry is we buy from a farmer that has them outside their whole life, right? And they get that micronutrient benefit of being on grass. They're still fed a lot of feed, but the feed that we finish is corn and soy free, non-GMO, and nutrient dense. So our birds even test on omega-6 to omega-3 profile. And all this data is on our site. We actually published a study on perennialpasturesranch.com. And so it's all up there. And that's what we hope to do. We're going to join this group called Audacious, which actually is a log, and it's a whole software program that benchmarks us against all other farms in the country. And we're actually going to pay for research to test our main competitors and show how we stack up, because not everybody's doing this. And it's a little bit disingenuous if you're not. It is expensive. Actually, it's not really that expensive. It's about $150 for a test. But if you're on a tight budget, it can be expensive. But we believe it's crucial to get this information out there to the public so that they can know exactly what's in their food and how to heal themselves.
Can you do a quick breakdown of grass-fed, grass-finished, grain-fed, grain-finished? Like you said, everyone starts out grass. Like, is it my understanding, if you go to a store and you buy a package of ground beef or whatever, and it says grass-fed, that's kind of deceptive, because what really matters is the finish. Ideally, we want no grain in there on either phase, but grass-fed alone doesn't tell you anything, because they can raise them on grass and then switch them to, what did you say, the CAFO model?
Yeah, so overall, our recommendation is try not to buy from the grocery store, but we do know that, 90% of folks still get a lot of their calories from the store. So if you can, develop a relationship with your local rancher and buy beef in bulk, because that's the ultimate sovereign step if we're talking about, sovereign food, sovereign finance, stability, right? Your guys' model, what is it? Protect, save, grow, right? So protect, like, how do we protect? Let's have some meat in a freezer, like that's a good way to protect. Let's do IBC. That's a good way to protect or save, so buy from your rancher. But grass-fed, grain finished is the majority of the meat, 95%, 98, no, 92%. So the grass finished industry is around 8 to 10%. So that's all the way through. So finished on, but you could still even have grass finished and have it be in a feedlot where they're just feeding hay and alfalfa and different, So really, it's about kind of knowing your farmer and rancher. There are some certifications that are developing now, which make it easier to just look at the label and understand. But I think that's what got us into trouble with the organic movement too, is people put all this trust just in these certifications and sort of abdicated their responsibility to actually go out and educate themselves on what they're actually putting in their body and their family's body. And I think, that's the beauty of becoming a parent, is when you're feeding another human being and literally building them up metabolically from conception to birth and all the way through, you're thinking about all these things and what's going into them. And, I grew up on Cinnamon Toast Crunch and Captain Crunch, right?
Hearts for
And
breakfast.
yeah, exactly, right? Heart healthy, the whole deal, whatever. So my son and daughter are now growing up on raw milk and pasture raised beef and bone broth and liver and, yeah, okay. They mix in a bar or two, and some puffs or whatever. But if like the staple part of their diet is these nutrient dense foods, then you're going to be better off. So I know that was a long answer to your question, Hans,
No, that's
about,
perfect.
but yeah, you kind of had a question packed in there about, how do we shop? And, because at the end of the day, you're trying to educate your base who's a little farther removed, but, like, don't trust every label, kind of figure it out, but grass finished is really what you want. But regenerative grass finished, is going to be coming from more nutrient dense soils, which, again, there's big variations on this. It's more so on the crop side where the variation comes, but that same Bionutrient Food Association that I mentioned earlier, they found with spinach that in terms of antioxidants, from one spinach leaf that was grown in a low nutrient environment to one that was grown in a high nutrient environment, there was a 365 to 1 degree difference in antioxidant levels from one spinach crop to another. So that's how massive it can be in
That's
terms of
unbelievable.
right. So
It's wild what you say about, feeding your kids. There's a farm in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. It goes by the Family Cow, or I think the website is yourfamilyfarmer.com, and they do drop points all over Pennsylvania. So we're an hour and a half drive from there, but they come by once a week and we order. So we've been drinking exclusively raw milk, I think 20 some years now. And my 5-year-old son, it's all he's ever had. Even when he could eat solids, he didn't want them. I mean, he drank like gallons a week as a little baby. He barely touched a solid piece of food until he was 2. And what's odd is he's the biggest of my 4 kids. And I can't think of one time in 5 years he's been down and sick and like laying in bed for a couple days kind of thing. Like, he's the healthiest kid ever, and he almost exclusively existed on raw milk for 2 years. And I mean, he still drinks it all the time. We all do, but yeah, it's pretty cool. It's amazing with what a nutrient dense food does for a child.
And if you're not a conspiracy theorist yet, quote conspiracy theorist, there are actual conspiracies and they have been revealed, so they're not theories anymore. We're conspiracy revealists, I guess. But just if you're still skeptical of, some of the stuff we talk about, just remember that while we were children, the FDA's advice was to eat sugar cereals and pasta as a staple of your diet. And skim milk was like, if you need a little bit of protein, you can have a skim milk, but stay away from red meat, processed turkey, like lean meat, margarine. I can't believe it's not butter, that kind of stuff. Like, that's what the FDA said. So you can just disregard everything they ever tell you ever again and jump on board and realize that they intentionally mislead, because those were all funded by the industries that wanted to be on the bottom of that pyramid.
Yeah. Treat the FDA like Jim Cramer. Whatever he says to do the opposite, and you'll probably be better off.
Yeah.
Or what do you call him? Crame Damsey or something like that? What's it?
Rave Damsey. That's our
Rave Damsey. Okay, yeah. I was listening to one of your podcasts. I was like, oh yeah, I know that guy, Rave. He's a funny guy.
He'll talk down to you, but he doesn't really understand, financial physics.
It would be great to see a debate, to be honest, with like the lead IBC guy, and him just, then publish it, somebody host it.
He won't do it. He'll have someone like draft up an illustration. It'll be just a base only standard whole life policy, which has the contractual rights that are the same, but nothing that we're trying to do. And he'll just cherry pick someone to argue with, and he just gets so heated, talks over everyone. I know Caleb Williams, who's a big podcaster in the IBC world, he's been trying to get him to debate it, but he won't, because he's so dug in on these ideas that he'll never reconsider a new thing. But can we talk a little more about raw milk dairy that you're trying to add to your product
So we'll
line?
be launching that this year for your listeners, in Southern California. We'll be having a dairy herd share. So you'll actually buy the cow, we'll milk it for you, and then you'll get access to, depending upon your herd share buy-in amount, however many gallons a week that you want. We'll have weekly drop-offs.
I'm already in.
All right, cool. Maybe that's what'll keep you in California there, Hans. Who knows? Make California great again. But yeah, so we'll be launching that. We're really excited. There's only 5 certified raw milk dairies in the state right now, which is probably actually fairly high as far as states go. I don't know. There's probably some other states that have a bunch of really small ones, but for certified retail ready milk. So there's a difference between this herd share model where you own it versus being able to sell in the stores. We do have the world's largest raw milk dairy in the world, and it's in California, and that's Mark McAfee and Raw Farm. And I got to give a shout out
That's
to
what we
him.
buy.
He's awesome. That's what my family's been drinking for a long time. We chose him. One, he's got really great distribution and makes it easy to pick up, but he's been just a pioneer and a leader in the movement for good, clean raw milk. They set up the RAMI Institute, which is the Raw Milk Institute, RAMI, and it teaches other raw milk farmers how to produce it clean and nutrient dense and right. So you can listen to some of his podcasts, but he's been on with Nicole Shanahan a few times. And then there's also a great book called The Untold Story of raw milk by Dr. Rob Schmidt. It's a great book. So yeah, when you start to know the early origins of how kind of milk, started getting here to this country from Europe, the original milk cows that came over, how it actually saved a lot of the early settlements because a lot of their crops failed when they first bring them over. And it was only when they brought the cows over that their staple food crops and starvation became less of an issue. So animal agriculture in terms of resiliency is also awesome. And then how it kind of got into the cities, and then our city movement grew, and then, everything was fine. We had great raw milk dairies all up and down the eastern seaboard and all the colonies. And then these cities started getting really big, and then industrial agriculture. And then what happened was we started producing a ton of spirits and whiskey, and the slop distillery grain dairies became a thing where they were just trying to maximize profit and pump cheap toxic grains into these cattle, and they became sick and acidic.
That's the swill milk scandal.
The swill milk. Yep, you got it right.
Yeah.
And so, in New York, it was particularly bad, and they didn't have automatic milking systems established at that point where it was all just still hand milking. So folks were getting sick and milking, into these pails. And then all that milk was going into the cities, and children were dying and getting sick. So it was a real problem, and they had to address it. And there was two approaches. One was Henry Coit, who was a physician and an MD, and developed a certification around raw milk for other physicians who saw the power of healing nutrient-dense raw milk produced on clean farms that were pasture-based. And so he developed this standard and certification, and free of charge, all these physicians got together and developed this whole thing, which is awesome. Imagine physicians getting together today free of charge on their own dime to develop a certification for a healthy food. It's kind of crazy to think about. So he did that, was a savior on that side of things. But then this other guy, Nathan Strauss, think of him as potentially an Elon Musk of his day, rich, successful, powerful businessman. And I support, for the record, what Elon's doing right now. But he kind of on the other side, to just show the power of folks, who are connected, kind of in the opposite direction, saw technology and pasteurization as a way to solve this. And he won out at the end of the day. He got the influence of the legislature, the presidency. I like President Theodore Roosevelt, cowboy president, had ranches on residence, but he eventually got convinced by this Strauss guy to kind of make it national policy that pasteurization was the way to go. And it was all kind of, all the milk would come in from the countries and go into these centralized pasteurization deals, and was all aggregated together. And it was a kind of a scale business opportunity for this guy Strauss. So that ended up winning out. That's why we, as opposed to Europe, who still has a pretty big raw milk and cheese culture over there, we have favored pasteurization, and why raw milk for the last 80 years. This was going on in the early 1900s. So I guess you could say for the last 100 years, we've favored pasteurization because of this guy, Nathan Strauss, just got in and got it into the legislature, and it just became part of our lexicon and our thinking that raw milk is bad and pasteurization is good. Well, now we're finding out, as the USDA has less influence and we're changing the pyramid and we trust these sources less, right? There used to be, 2 or 3 different news stations, and our parents grew up trusting the news. To a large extent, it was unbiased. It was good reporting. Now there's so much more diversity, which is great. We got podcasts and we got however many different news stations. And so the diversity of information, and hopefully the truth, is making its way out more. And people are finding, God, I have all these health issues, and I started drinking raw milk and I feel 10 times better. I can digest it. I can, my energy levels are up. My fat levels are up, all this, good stuff. So hopefully we're at the precipice of a new movement back to raw milk, but it's got to be clean. It's got to be produced by a professional producer, meaning they know what the hell they're doing in terms of cleanliness. Pasture, meaning like they're doing good regenerative production, because the more nutrient dense the milk is, the less likely you are to get sick. And so, there's still a very low risk of getting sick. I know a raw milk dairyman here, Mark Duvenvoorden in Reading. Shout out to Mark, great guy. He's been doing raw milk for 17 years now. He made a switch from conventional to raw, saw the opportunity. He hasn't gotten one person sick in 17 years of doing it. Mark McAfee has had a few issues, but nobody's ever died from his milk, but a few folks have gotten sick because he's at a bigger scale than Duvenvoorden. Duvenvoorden only has 80 cows. Mark McAfee's got like 1,800 now. And so, at that kind of scale, but Mark tests a lot. So there's all these things,
What's so nonsensical about it is you can find these isolated cases of somebody getting sick, and they try to shut farms down, and they try to shut down production of raw milk and the sale of raw milk. And then something comes along where there has to be a massive recall with conventionally produced food that's on the grocery shelves. And that's all they do. They recall it, and they get rid of that, well, I'm going to call it crop, even if it's processed food, and they put it right back on the shelves with almost no recourse. So it's interesting that there's such a heavy weight from the government, from the USDA against raw milk. It doesn't even make sense for the low incidence of injury for people. And typically, like you're saying, it's coming from a place where it's really not done right. It's so cool to hear that there's educational institutions out there teaching people how to produce it properly.
Yeah, the most recent episode with Mark was brutal. I think they shut him down for a month. He tests all the time. He's like invested in more testing than any operate. That's why I love buying his stuff, because he tests and holds, and he works with all these microbiologists from UC Davis, and I'm getting more and more educated on that side of things. But he tests, and for this recent bird flu deal, it was a retail dairy that was also testing, that reported him, not a retail dairy, but a retail location, a shop that kind of reported him and said, hey, it tested positive for this. They went back to the batch and they tested the batch and they said, well, we aren't seeing it, And then so there was this debate whether, it was a PCR test or this and the antibodies and whatever, what have you. But if you zoom out of that, right, the cows don't die. They get sick for a little while and their production goes down, but they don't die. They get better, and then they have the antibodies to bird flu, right? And there's never been one single documented case of bird flu passing from a cow to a human being. But yet they're shutting everything down and this guy's production down and seriously trying to hamper his business, I think, politically, for political reasons, because he's, I guess, producing the nutrient dense food that that they don't want us to have. Or again, I don't see why they don't want us to have this product.
The whole bird flu thing really, it runs a little bit parallel to what I remember some doctors saying at the early COVID. Like, children were virtually unaffected by it. It was almost a sniffle for them, but we pulled them all out of schools and took them away, isolated them within their own family. And it was like, these are the people that are going to make everybody healthy, because they built up their immune systems and everybody else
Yeah.
from that. But we're going to isolate them. And it's the same thing on this bird flu. Like, even if it is chickens, and it's interesting that we're not killing off all the ducks of the world too, but it's like, just even the chickens who survive it are going to help the herd or the flock or whatever, down the road. It's, why are we killing them all? So we're not building up any resistance to whatever this flu is among the birds of the country. We're just going to slaughter them. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I'm hoping we can start in, getting some sanity kind of back into those departments. And I think, as we're seeing, there's just a ton of waste, a ton of legacy thought, ton of errant spending. So hoping we can kind of bring these agencies back into balance and have them be rooted and really research from farmers and ranchers with skin in the game, who have something to lose and who know really what they're doing, because there's so many amazing, great, professional producers that just, they're so smart, and Mark McAfee's one of them. I have the blessing of being sort of second generation in this movement, because regenerative agriculture has kind of been going on for about 40 years now. And so I'm standing on the back of giants, and I'm just building on their work and trying to take it to the next level. And hopefully we'll start to jump that chasm, into the early adopters, and I think we're right there. And so hopefully this administration can help us jump that chasm and get guys like Mark, to develop a raw milk ordinance and better food safety, policies and whatnot. So,
and hopefully as the fallout continues for getting rid of Chevron deference, where these these agencies no longer have the teeth to enforce things that they did. Hopefully one of the things we see is that these agencies, okay, if you have an FDA, they should be advisory, like, hey, we're putting out a warning. You are consumers making purchases from, like independent commerce. Like, we don't get to to go in and just shut down and say, we're going to shut down your entire production. Like, there should be there's nowhere in the Constitution, there's nowhere that you can cite where the FDA would have the authority to do that. And my response when I hear all this, I just think all these individuals involved should be drawn and quartered. But if we don't go with my route, we don't take the full Stasi approach on this, at least tar and feather. But then stepping back from that, let's just relegate them. Let's relegate them to an advisory. Like, hey, adults who get to determine these decisions about their health, just a heads up, we think we detected this. Here's how we came up with this determination. We recommend maybe don't purchase this or whatever, but to just have the authority to go in and shut down production, pull it from the shelves. I mean, I was going ballistic. And if you like last couple podcast episodes, we're talking about the raw milk, like how we can't get it. Eggs are just totally gone right now. We can't get them. And it just infuriates me. So if we're not going to go with my remedy, I at least hope that Chevron deference being peeled back gets us to where we can
That's a great reference, and I'm pretty excited about that too, especially from a land use perspective, because there's the BLM, the Forest Service, and all these agencies that control massive amounts of acreage in the West. And, they don't have regenerative ranchers, working there for them. Nobody who's advising on the policy probably has ever actually had skin in the game ranching before. So they're dictating the stocking rate, the management plans for these lands. So if we want to really actually heal land and bring regenerative production, we're going to have to figure out something there. And my thought is, that hopefully it comes down to some sort of case, eventually, and then it goes to the courts. And then, now the agencies don't have as much power as they used to, where the courts would just defer. Now it's actually debated, but it's probably going to take a while to work its way through there, as it is, with some of the food safety stuff as well. But yeah, I thought I was pretty fired up on that, because as I've been looking to expand my operation and go and finance, ranches to buy and things like that, I'm looking at these 60, 70,000 acre pieces of land. And because you need scale in ranching to make this work, right? And the land is big in the West, Brian, probably the average, size farm in Pennsylvania is not that big. You got a lot more rainfall out there. You can carry more animals. Out here in the West, we got less, so we need larger acreages to make it happen. But when you go and look at acquiring these ranches, 80% of them have the majority of the land in some sort of BLM or state kind of controlled thing, where you're at the whim of the local, resource conservation, person to determine how you actually manage it. When we know as ranchers now how to go in there and in 3 to 5 years have that thing, have the soil covered, have the grass growing back, have all this, photosynthesis maximized. But it's a huge hamstring to have those, or so either we got to reprivatize it, change it, whatever. I'm also a proponent of hunting as well. And I went and recently chucker hunted in northern Nevada, and it was a great time. German short-haired pointing dogs and everything. And the guy was a big public lands proponent. So you got to find a way for the act, because in Nevada, I think 95% of the land's public, and the hunters love it there. But how do you find a way to kind of get better management back on the land through private ownership, but still have the public be able to have access to recreate and do things like that? So maybe there's a solution in there. That's the one hiccup that I see being in the West, that there's so many hunters and folks that want to go out to these public lands and whatnot. I think we could figure it out. I really do.
Yeah, guys, money talks. Like, if you're listening to this and you want to see these changes happen, you got to buy the product. Like Nelson's rule, he who has the gold makes the rules. Like Kevin and other regenerative ranchers need to continue this business. Like, having these ideas and these goals is awesome, but if people aren't buying it, like the factory farming model and the grain fed beef, etc., like, they're going to keep winning as long as we want the cheap product. It's always there on the shelf. I can get whatever I want at any time. To make some changes, and we got to support what we want. So speaking of money, let's talk about what you're doing, your expansion. We'll get into the investment opportunity here, but in addition to just buying, like selling beef from Perennial Pastures, how are you guys expanding? And let's talk a little bit about what you guys have going on with that.
Yeah, so like I said, in 2020, we bought a local cattle company, transitioned it from a conventional cow-calf operation to a direct-to-consumer regenerative beef business. Beef and chicken, we sell lamb as well. Like I said, we have the farmers markets and online business. So business has been going great, booming. We've 10x sales since our start. We're hitting a really good clip now. We started an aggregation network where we're buying from other local ranches, but we want to get more of our own production into play. So we have an opportunity to go out and put together some nice ranching assets that we could then, develop our own portfolio from. And that really is kind of our strategy, is this vertical play where we control almost everything except the processing. Processing is a very tough business. At the start, I did want to do the processing, but right now, I'm fine with just producing and selling at this point, because that's where a lot of the IP is in this vertical, is on the production side, doing the regenerative ranching and then marketing it and developing a world-class e-commerce end-to-end solution with nationwide distribution. So we're in building the supply chain mode right now, because there's still not a lot of this production. And we have our regenerative certification group out there trying to aggregate more beef for us. but it's a tough go. The cattle markets are at an all-time high. Folks can get a lot of money just selling at the sale barn. So building that supply chain is proving to be difficult. So we'd like to just have our destiny in our own hands and go out and get these big ranches that we could produce thousands of head of beef on and scale the operation. So we have some stuff that we're circulating right now. I've given you guys the information memorandum on that, and we're kind of, sending it out to select groups of accredited investors. And again, this is not a solicitation for any security or anything like that, just talking informationally about it. But I think it's one of the best investment opportunities of our time. It's a real asset. It gets better over time, a lot like, infinite banking. It's based on natural principles of taking care of the base and the soil and harvesting a little yield off the land every year, but then giving more back into it for it to just continue to grow. And so, yeah, I'm super excited about it as an asset class. I think globally, there's going to be a massive transition of assets from one generation to the next, because the average age of farmers and ranchers is 60 and 70 years old in all the nations across the country. And so all those assets are going to transfer to a new generation, but the new generation's undercapitalized. There's a massive capital gap. All these old ranches and farms need to be updated. Those old timers put in all that hard work to build the barns, to put the fencing in, to put the water in, all this stuff. So they need to be recapitalized, retooled, and ready to rock and roll to supply nutrient dense food to our population, which hopefully continues to grow. That's a whole nother, argument of whether we're at the cap or not. We're totally not at the cap. And I think as a strategy, as a nation, we should look at continuing to grow our population and people having more kids, because it's just a great national policy to have. You see these other nations that have de-emphasized that, like Japan and China, and their whole macroeconomic things going in a whole nother direction. But, that's a whole nother topic for another podcast. But yeah, anyway, so super stoked on that. And, we're happy to talk more about it.
So if let's say Brian's investing group in Pittsburgh, if someone wants to get in on this, like how does it actually look? So my understanding, you guys are looking at these ranches that might be not dead, that's not the right word, but just not productive, desertified, and you're going to go in with your team, because you have a team of real estate guys, developers, financiers, et cetera. Like you have this core team, and you are the ranching and the regenerative soil expert on that team, and you guys are leasing a new plot.
Yeah, buying an actual asset. Yeah, owning it. Yeah. So it's very much, I listened to your guys' episode with the guy from RP Capital. I forget his name, but
Shane Thompson.
Shane. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, really awesome podcast you guys did. Very similar. It's just on the ranching side of the business, right? So we're syndicating ranch deals instead of apartment deals. But if you think about it as an apartment, we're not the Nordstrom investors. We're kind of like, I forget this guy, Jermaine Massey, has this cash flow podcast, and he would talk about like there's the Nordstrom investors, the Vons investors, and the Walmart investors. We're probably meaning like in terms of quality of assets. And so we're probably kind of in that Walmart, Vons sort of, realm, meaning like we buy underutilized, sort of dilapidated ranches, fix them up, put the water infrastructure and the fencing infrastructure in to start our regenerative ranching program, and then take it to a new level of productivity, bring the appreciation up, potentially sell some carbon credits off the land, produce nutrient dense beef for our supply chain. And then either buy and hold strategy for the long term, or recapitalize that through a refinancing strategy to some lower risk investor that just wants to hold a fully regenerated real asset that just has a super solid, stable cash flow. Perhaps, an bigger IBC investor that just wants some nice dividends, coming off a ranch. So,
well, that ties in well with IBC, because, I'm trying to figure out, I want to get in on this investment, but the idea that I can, just same way with a mutual company, I pay my premium, I support the company that I'm a mutual owner of, and the dividends come back to me. So by my normal spending habits, as far as, in insurance, at least as far as paying premium, I'm contributing to the health and profitability of a company that I'm a part owner of. In the same way, it was kind of cool thinking about this idea where, I just pulled from my freezer in the office here. I've got, some of your meat right here. I got the ground beef. I got a roast here, and then I got these beef sticks, which I'm hooked on right now. This is like a Slim Jim with 1,000 times better quality and a clean ingredient list. But like these things are awesome. And my daughter, trying to get a 3-year-old to, protein is always just my daughter, she eats well, but it's awesome to be able to give her one of these. She loves it and gets protein right here. So I always have these in her snack bag. I always have them with me now. They're awesome, but it's cool. Like if I'm an investor in this, the actual output and how the return on the investment, as I understand it, is determined is based on your sales as a ranch, right? So you're doing all this stuff behind the scenes. You're buying new land, bringing back the soil, expanding your grazing, all that stuff is happening. Everything we've talked about up till now, you're doing that. But the actual metric by which the profitability of an investment is determined is sales from the ranch. And so I can keep buying these beef sticks. I can keep buying this, this grass-fed, grass-finished beef and contribute to the profitability of something that I'm not an owner of, but an investor. And it's just awesome. It's kind of tying it all together.
Eat your investment in portfolio.
Yeah.
Maybe that should be our tagline for the raise.
That's pretty good. So for somebody investing in your farm, like what about some of the risks? I mean, disease, for example, like we're seeing in the news right now among a herd. What are the major risks that somebody would want to think about, or how do you mitigate some of those?
For the disease and total loss of the herd, we carry insurance for that. So there's livestock insurance for kind of acts of God, fires, and disease outbreaks and things like that we get covered for. Through our regenerative production, we're trying to produce nutrient-dense cows, and they get sick a lot less coming off very minerally rich soils. So there's mitigation strategies there as well, where they just get a lot sicker. And then there's some ways that we can design, in terms of fire risk. You can cut fire breaks. We got a forestry mulching machine. You can graze in a way where you graze like the outside parts of your ranch in a way prior to the inside area, so that if a fire was to come from the outside, it doesn't burn up your whole ranch. But you can also get pasture insurance too, where if it did burn, you get paid out on that. So there's some decent insurance mechanisms that kind of protect the downside risk. And then obviously you have the soil building elements that also protect us from the downside risk. And then we come to weather risks and things like droughts and whatnot. We believe that through regenerative production, we can actually drought-proof a ranch. And I'll tell you how that works. Let's take a 100,000 acre ranch, for example. And on a typical ranch, maybe you got 10 to 20 pastures, right? So these pastures are, if there's 10,000 acre, pastures on a 100,000 acre ranch, you move the animals, let's say every once a month, right? When you're looking at how they move through that 10,000 acre pasture, you're not actually seeing how much forage they're consuming in a day, right? When you do high density grazing and you have, let's say, 1,000 pastures across that 100,000 acre ranch, and they're moving multiple times per day, you can see how much they're eating in a day, meaning you could draw on Google Earth or whatever, and you have your pasture identified, and you say, okay, it takes 10 acres, it takes 100 acres for my cow herd to maintain optimal body condition, to stay fat, to have a full rumen. It's a very precise metric, and we even have walkover weighing scales. That's in the information memorandum, where when they're walking to water or to new pasture, they go over scale and you can weigh them daily. This is new technology that's never been available, and have individual management tracking of those animals as they go to new pasture. Well, pretty quick, in about a week or two, when the rain shuts off, because typically in the West here, we have rainy season, dry season. So you grow up your whole great growing season. You got this stockpile of grass. That is your crop. When the rain shuts off and you're working through stockpile. So in the dry season, you know how much they're consuming in a day. And you can say, hey, I have 2 months of grass ahead of me. I have 6 months of grass ahead of me. I have a year's worth of grass ahead of me. Well, we try to time it in the arid West with our recovery periods and everything, because this is all planned out to have 2 years of grass ahead of us on a lot of these really dry ranches. So if we know, hey, we're overstocked and, we only have a year's worth of grass ahead of us, and it might not rain in 2 years ahead, because traditionally sometimes these areas that are really dry, it won't rain for a couple of years. So you want all that stockpile out ahead, so you can make stocking and restocking decisions years ahead of what a conventional rancher might do, where he's just kind of visualizing, is there enough grass out there? They're kind of overeating these ones and they're over resting these ones. Like, what is my true stockpile of grass? And so we're working on these more advanced metrics, and we use also hyperspectral imagery to measure this stockpile. Meaning, there's a satellite, a Landsat satellite that flies over every week that's taking a consistent picture of the land, and it'll tell us how much stockpile we have out ahead of us, how much we've consumed, what's the health of our land looking, are we leaving enough residual behind, are we getting enough trample, how is the ranch improving over time, are we getting more grass plants to grow per square meter than we did before. So
that's the most epic response as far as how are we mitigating downsides. Like that's I didn't know that. That's incredible.
It's fascinating. Like it's crazy that you're using satellite technology now to plan years in advance based on a weekly picture. Absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
it's crazy. And that's where we're taking like this 40 years of regenerative agriculture knowledge base and then these amazing pioneers that have developed all these techniques, and then we're layering on things like hyperspectral imagery and walkover weighing scales and other maybe finance tools or what have you to just make it better, right? So it's fun. We're not quite there yet. Nobody's really pulled off this full scale direct to consumer, production, ranch syndication to plate sort of approach yet. So we're still very early on. Like, we don't have like RP Capital, they're that dude's been doing it 25 years. He's got his thing, well oiled and whatever. We're still, 5 years in, and it's still very new. So still very much a startup, but we believe the tenants are there for it to be this, kind of IBC type of deal where the water just kind of keeps rising and the stability is just super, super strong,
Yeah. Imagine if you can get that. You talked about the lack of capital. Young folks getting into this are not capitalized. Imagine the marriage of these two worlds where people learn to build generational capital so that what you're doing can advance to the next generation, because unfortunately you're 37 and someday you're going to be old. And, and then the next generation being capitalized and being able to stand on the shoulders of you who stood on the shoulder of giants. It's just such a phenomenal thought process.
For sure. Yeah. And when you could layer in the IBC layer, and what was the guy's name? I talked to him in Pennsylvania.
Brett.
Yeah. So he had even had some ideas where like they're putting together, like IBC products, but like as a collective of producers, and then investing in different projects that collective of producers needs. There's always infrastructure updates and different things. So if there's these little nuclei of, the banks are in the community now as opposed to, with the big banks, and we're coming up with unique terms and requirements, and the capital is just staying there locally, the ecological capital, the social capital, the financial capital. And yeah, I mean, the multiplying effect is kind of mind boggling. Yeah. When you think about it. And I mean, I've only kind of come back into infinite banking pretty recently. I'd say like a month in. I mean, I reached out to Hans about a month ago, and yeah, I'm like, okay, it all happens when you're ready, right? When the soil's ready, the seed will sprout. And so I'm glad I kind of came back to it and remained open. But I think it's prime for opportunity, and just got to kind of stay at it and execute every day and make it happen. So.
Yeah, it's awesome. It ties in well, just the long-term thinking that you mentioned earlier. And we don't pitch investments, we don't give financial advice, but I can give you an investment advice here, investing in the health and nutrient of the nutrient quality of your family. I want to show real quick just the screen here, if that's okay. I want to show your one option if you want to invest in your family here, buying a whole cow or a half cow and getting this freezer that it comes in. You can see here for the YouTube watchers, like if you want to actually contribute to what we're talking about here, contribute to the strength of this industry, tip the scales away from the FDA, the factory farming, et cetera, and actually get back in touch with knowing the source of where your food's coming from. This is a great way. I am actively trying to empty my freezer now so that we can, get a full, this is essentially a year's worth, as you say, for if you get the whole beef here. Anything you want to talk about on this deal? Or we've also got, just the shop now here. We've got different options for how to
that's our whole cow with free freezer offer, and appreciate you sharing this, Hans. And yeah, we found out a lot of people's barrier to bulk beef is not having freezer space, so we just kind of took that out of the equation. And this is a nationwide offer. We can ship a freezer, straight to your door, ship a whole cow straight to your door.
Free shipping here.
And for those not watching this on YouTube, he's at perennialpasturesranch.com. Because I had the same problem, I'm going to spell perennial, Pernnial, pasturesranch.com. You can even call. It's right there on the website. If you want to call and talk to their team, 415-910-9793 to see what their options are.
Cool. Well, we've taken up a lot of time. Really appreciate you joining us. Anything else you want to talk about? How the people can support you besides buying from the website? Anything else on IBC? We don't have to wrap up here, but it's going to be our longest and most powerful episode, I think. And it ties into our community, what they're interested in. It's just such an awesome way to kind of expand within our ecosystem, things that we're all already thinking about and wanting for our families.
Yeah, I'm super fired up to just start the conversation. I think, we can have, some future episodes as I get more into, IBC and, maybe some land investing and different things, that we do out of it, and circle back, and just really appreciate you guys and what you do and bringing, financial awareness and stability to folks, and really appreciate, how you guys approach life, and stoked to thank you for promoting, what I'm doing and being great customers, and yeah, just excited for the future, and wish you guys the best.
Hey, Kevin, I wanted to pull up the farm that we buy milk from, and I thought it was cool. In 2013, the family cow was the 5th raw milk dairy to pass and be listed by Rami.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's
cool.
super cool.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
they have a whole blurb about that, and they mentioned Mark McAfee, and pretty cool.
There you go.
Cool little
Yeah.
connection there.
That's awesome.
Brett and I have talked, and we're going to try to make it out this year, 2025. We're going to fly out and try to visit. Looking forward
Cool.
to it.
All right. Well, we should have the dairy up and running by then. So stoked to meet you in person, Brian. And yeah, Hans, we'll keep it going. And thank you guys so much.
We'll have your policy wrapped up soon here. We're in underwriting right now. And yeah, looking forward to it, man.
Cool. Sounds good.
Thanks for coming on, Kevin. We appreciate you. Good conversation, man. I enjoyed it. Hope to do another one.
All right. Sounds good, Brian. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. And we'll see you next week. Cheers.